Hi everyone, it's Taylor here. Thanks for joining me for our 13th birthday celebration at Tailored Expressions. Today we'll be creating these two cards, one that's a more simple version and one that is a stepped up shaker card. I'll be using the piece of cake layering stencil. You can see it's a 2-layer stencil that creates the different layers on the cake along with the cake stand, and then you have two options for the topper. You can use stars or flames. Then we have the piece of cake additions with sentiments to fit within the cake layers and cake decorations and a cake stand. We also have a coordinating die set to create candles and flames, a cake stand, and the layered cake pieces. I'll be using the A2 thin frame cutting plate, the mini strips birthday stamp along with the coordinating die. Then I have heat resistant window acetate that I'll be using for the shaker card, along with foam sticky strips on the shaker card as well. I'll be using my Bitty blender brushes to do the blending across the stencil and several different colors of Tailored Expressions ink. I have Lollipop, candy corn, pineapple, lime zest, blue raspberry, jelly donut, Earl Grey, and Oreo. I'll be doing some embossing as well, so I have my Versamark watermark stamp pad, my white embossing powder, and my powder tool. I'll be using Nuvo Moonstone Glimmer Paste with my Nuvo Media spatula. And I'll be using our brand new Tiny Diamonds. These are tiny little embellishments in both bold and pastel colors that match our cardstock colors perfectly. I have my Scotch removable adhesive and my Tombow Mono Multi liquid glue. So let's get started. I'm going to adhere my cardstock down to my placemat and then use the purple tape to place the stencil in place while I do my blending. I'm going to start with the top layer and the Lollipop ink and continue in rainbow order. However, each layer of the cake is skipped, so instead of moving to orange, I am skipping down to the pineapple, and the second layer will include the orange. So here I have skipped the green and moved down to the blue raspberry color for the last layer of the cake, and then we can replace with the second stencil and fill in those open layers. As long as you line that up just perfectly within the 6x6 opening of your grid paper placemat, then you know your cake will be aligned perfectly on your A2 piece of cardstock. So I filled that top layer in with the candy corn and the bottom layer with the lime zest. The Bitty blender brushes make it really easy to stay within the openings without having to use any masking paper or tape or any of that. I'm going to fill in the top, the stars, with the pineapple ink and a tiny little bit of candy corn ink on those stars as well, just to give them a little bit of extra dimension. You can see how cool that turned out, and we're just going to place that piece into the MISTI and use the sentiment wishing you a very happy birthday. I'm simply going to stamp that with the Oreo ink. The black is going to provide a really nice contrast to all of the rainbow colors that we blended. Then we need to attach our stars with the little sticks that come as the clear stamp, and I'm going to do that in Earl Grey. I didn't want something quite so stark and black, so I went with the Earl Grey ink for the sticks. Now I have placed my metal shim down with my A2 thin frame cutting plate and some Oreo cardstock, and I've cut out all of those thin frames. I'll be using a couple different sizes on the two cards we are creating in today's video. I wanted a frame of white around the outside, so I chose the frame that is one size smaller than the A2 card base size, and I'm adhering that with my Tombow Mono Multi liquid glue around the outside of that panel. I'm going to place my stencil back in place so that I can add my Nuvo Moonstone Glimmer Paste. I chose to do this step last because it's going to take a little bit of time to dry, and I didn't want to do it at the time that I was stencil brushing. So I saved this step for last, and it creates a really pretty sparkly effect on those stars. Now it's not quite dry yet, so I probably would normally wait for this to dry before I try to adhere it to my card base, but I'm just picking and placing those pieces of foam tape on the back and being very careful that I don't touch my wet paste before I adhere this down to the card base. So I decided to create basically the same card and just step it up a little bit. So I'm using the same colors, and we're going to create a shaker this time. So I have the Lollipop ink and then the pineapple and the blue raspberry at the bottom, and then I will switch that out to include the other two missing layers. We're going to be doing the candy corn and the lime zest. Now, laying the ink down first is just going to give me a base of color. I do plan to place the shaker bits within those openings, and so I need to cut an opening in a second piece of white cardstock. I have aligned that with the first piece so that I know about where to cut. You could always trim excess off after you've done this, but I wanted to make sure that I know where to line those two pieces up with each other. So the piece that I die cut is eventually going to get placed over the top of this and popped up. Before I can do that, I need to prepare my window acetate, and I wanted to add some of those pieces of decor to the actual window acetate and not behind it on the layer, because I thought it would just stand out a little bit better. So I've prepped my acetate with the powder tool, and all of those extra little bits that end up sticking, if you have any of those, just use a paintbrush to wipe them away, and then you can use a clean cloth to wipe away that residue from the powder tool. So now you can see how those decorations line up with my cake piece, and I can adhere my piece of acetate behind the die cut openings in the window. I want to make sure that I adhere between all of the layers just so that none of my bits are escaping into one another. And then I can place that piece over the top of the blended piece. You can see how those decorations look within the openings of that die cut piece. Now I'm adding my cake stand to the top layer, the piece with the acetate on it, and I also need to add the stars at the top of the cake as well. So I'm going to do that with the stencil layer, lining it up with the blended layers and blending with my pineapple ink and bitty blender brush. Again, I did add some of that orange just to give it a little bit of added dimension on those stars. So you can see the top layer includes the stars, the little sticks, and the cake stand. And then behind that is where we stenciled all of those colored layer cakes. So you can see what my two layers look like before we adhere them together. Now we're going to take those foam sticky strips and place them between each layer of the cake. This is a little bit, I don't want to say tedious, but it is kind of exacting work because I don't want all of my pieces of shaker material to run together. I want them to each have their own well so that they stay separated on my card front. So I've placed that foam sticky tape in between all of the layers, and now I need to fill them with the different colors. And I'm choosing colors to match the ink colors that I use to blend the different layers. So I'm starting at the top with the Lollipop and just dumping a few of those shaker bits, the tiny diamonds, into each opening. And if I had any escapees, I took my little tweezers and made sure they made their way back to the correct home before I adhered the shaker all together. So you can see how that looks with those fun tiny diamonds in all of the openings. And now we are ready to stamp our sentiment before this card gets finished off. So I'm going to again condition my cardstock with my powder tool. This is Oreo cardstock, and then we're going to stamp with the Versamark ink and emboss with the white embossing powder. You can see that residue from the powder tool on the Oreo cardstock, which is okay. You can wipe that away with a clean cloth or rag after you finish doing your embossing. Just make sure your sentiments are all heated before you rub it with your cloth. And then you can send it through your die cut machine to cut out all of those sentiments in one pass and adhere whichever sentiment you want on the front of your card. I'm going to use Make a Wish. I'm just going to adhere that right over the top of the acetate on that largest layer of the cake. I'm taking another one of the thin frames that we cut from Oreo cardstock and adhering that around the outside edge of my panel, and then I will just take that and adhere it to a white card base. I kept it really simple with the card bases because I wanted those card panels to speak for themselves with the pretty rainbow colors. Thanks for joining me for today's video. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you hit the subscribe button so you don't miss a thing at Tailored Expressions.